So the first speaker is Ted Habermann, who is going to be talking about instrument metadata at DataCite. And I'll just add that we monitor the Zoom chat and the Slack channel. So if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out. And Ted, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you see something that looks like a title?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to have a chance to talk a little bit about instrument metadata, one of my favorite things. And I'm going to talk about instrument data at DataCite and tell you something about DataCite. There's a timestamp in the title of this because, of course, like so many things, this is a changing picture. But I'll try and give you a sort of an up-to-date snapshot. So first we have to get into the right app here. So DataCite is a DOI provider, a digital object identifier provider, and a repository with over 3,000 members from all over the world, universities, government agencies, private and for-profit and nonprofit organizations that use DataCite as a repository for metadata about a wide variety of things. Those members can have more than one repository, so there's over 3,000 repositories, sort of subsets of DataCite. Right now, there are about 60 million resources in DataCite, and those resources have 28 different types. So DataCite started out with a focus on data sets and also on text resources a little bit later, and now physical samples and 25 different other resources in addition to that. These are the kinds of resources that are there where there are more than 500,000. Data sets are still overall time the largest segment of the repository, followed by various kinds of text objects, and then physical objects, which are primarily samples and images. There are a lot of other kinds of resources that are less than 500,000. You can see them here, and you can read these yourself. And down at the bottom of the pile is instruments. So right now in DataCite, there's about 200. There are DOIs have been issued for about 200 instruments. And that, as you'll see in the next slide, that started last year, having that capability. And so what's important about instruments at DataCite is we're really at the beginning of giving digital object identifiers to instruments, and that gives us a chance to work with the community, like so many that are here, in terms of talking about how we can take advantage of DataCite and its capabilities to describe these instruments and connect them into the larger research picture. So we have an instrument, and in prior to last year, DataCite has a metadata element called resource type, which is a recommended element, and it's free text. So if you had an instrument, you could describe that instrument to some extent in a free text field. In January of last year, with version 4.5 of the schema, instrument became a resource type general. Unfortunately, these aren't great names, but resource type general is a mandatory field. So all records in a DataCite have a resource type general, and it's a shared vocabulary that defines those 28 resource types that I mentioned on the last slide. And instrument became one of those in January of last year. So one of the primary goals of DataCite metadata is to support discovery and description. We'll talk about that later, but the other the critical piece about it is it provides a unique and global and persistent identifier that can be used for connecting those instruments using things called related identifiers. So at the same time, in January of last year, the instruments became sort of a first-class resource type. There were two kinds of connections added, one being collects. So an instrument collects a data set, and a data set is collected by that instrument. So that allows you to connect those instruments once they have identifiers to data sets and as we'll see shortly, other kinds of things. But those connections are really the important piece of, or a super critical piece of the DataCite metadata. So this is, I mentioned that we're now at about 200 instruments. So you can see beginning in the middle of last year, May of 2024, we had about 60. And then there are a couple large steps as we went from 60 up to 100. And these are the organizations that were responsible for those steps. The Technical University of Denmark, the University of Western Australia, and the 2D Crystal Consortium, which is one of the facilities that CI Compass is involved with. And so we see big steps. The last time I gave this talk was actually the day before that big University of Western Australia step, and I was surprised to find the next day that the number had increased significantly. And so, as I said, we're sort of at the beginning of this business, and we have a lot of opportunities for thinking about how we can do this well. And that's why I'm super happy to be here talking today. So we can look at the content of these things, and unfortunately, there's a lot of small things here, but this gives you some idea of what exists in the metadata records for these 200 instruments. There are, I guess there's actually 194 of them. So this line shows that a number of these metadata elements are complete. They exist in, they occur more than the number of records, and in most cases, that means all of the records have them. The yellow bars in this are the required fields. So the fact that the URL, the landing page, or the publisher, or the resource type general that we talked about, or the publication date, the fact that those yellow things are yellow elements are complete is because they're mandatory. They must be there to get the metadata in. Down at the bottom are keywords, so subjects, and keywords, a lot of keywords, of course, because records can have multiple keywords. But then the important thing about this slide is that, so the sort of between the zero axis and that line of completeness, there's a large empty space where we have a lot of opportunities in the DataCite metadata schema to provide more metadata that will be helpful in understanding these instruments. And some of that is related to funding. In this case, the blue bars are related to funding. The green bars are related to descriptive information that we'll talk about in a minute. The red bars are related to various kinds of identifiers, and the yellow bars, as I said, are mandatory. And the identifiers in this case are funder identifiers up there at the top, only occurring maybe less than 20 times. RORs are research organization registry. They're identifiers for research organizations that can contribute to research outputs in many ways. The award identifiers come from funders, obviously. They're a little bit more, you can have multiple awards for the same funder, and in many of the facilities that CI Compass is dealing with, that's true. And then at the bottom, we have RORs and also ORCIDs. So ORCIDs are for researchers, they're for people. RORs, again, are organizations. And both of those kinds of things, people and organizations, can function as authors in this case. But once again, we can see even for identifiers that are what we need to connect funders or organizations or awards to those instruments. We have quite a bit of opportunity for adding those to these records. So talking a little bit about instrument metadata at DataCite, I mentioned resource type general. That's the instrument in this case, and there are 28 of those. And then the DOI, and you can have DOIs and alternative identifiers on the left here. That's sort of the least detail that we can have about instruments. Resource type, I mentioned earlier, it's the free text description of the instrument. So we have instrument for resource type general, and then we have resource type that could be more descriptive information, a title, the instrument name, more descriptive alternative titles like an acronym. Many instruments, as you all know, have acronyms. And then full text description, either a technical info description or an abstract. These are all metadata elements that are in the DataCite schema, and it sort of gives you a spectrum of detail in terms of describing instruments, starting with the identifier and then all the way to technical information or an abstract. And so this is an important thing to remember. Only having the resource type or the identifier, it doesn't really take advantage of the capabilities that the metadata schema brings. I mentioned connections done by related identifiers, and these are connections to other things. So they could be connections to papers, connections to presentations, connections to all kinds of things, software, etc. And they have types, they have relations. So described by, has metadata, is version of, has part or is part of. There's a lot of instruments that are nested sort of among each other. References is cited by, so papers that cite the instrument, and then the data set connections collects and is collected by. A lot of these things that go in two directions, either to the data or from the data. So those are the connections. Keeping track of people is also important, people and organizations. So hosting institutions, data collector, it could be an organization or it could be a person, and a sponsor. In a lot of situations, we have facilities that provide in-kind support to people that are using those facilities. So these are contributors. They would be identified with roars or orchids, and they would get connected that way. The connections on the left side of this would typically have DOIs or other kinds of identifiers for making those connections. And then finally, we don't want to forget the funders. This is the funder metadata that exists in DataCite. The name and critically the identifier and the award number and the award title are things that connect the instruments. So we have metadata elements across the top here, and then connections to various things across the bottom. I showed in the metadata content slide the elements that are mandatory. They're shown here as red. So of all these things that you can put in the metadata to be useful, only 3 of them are mandatory. And if we think about DataCite as a way to get a DOI quickly and easily, generally we only have the mandatory elements. So we're really missing a lot of opportunities to inject into the system more metadata in that schema, and that's one of my soapboxes. Also trying to help people understand that they're buying these DOIs. They should take advantage of their capabilities. So thinking in terms of that model, this is 2 time periods prior to last September and then prior to this month, the completeness of those various things. On the left are the descriptions. On the far left are the resource type general and the resource title. Those 2 are mandatory, so we're glad that they're all there. And then the other descriptive elements are generally occurring 30 to 50% of the time. These are the connections that I mentioned, connections to various things, and some of these happen as a function of time, over time, references to to instruments, for instance, would be added to the metadata as they occur over time. And then contributors, in this case, hosting institution is a kind of contributor, and it occurs somewhere around in about 70% of the records. Things that are missing aren't in any of the records are data collector and sponsor. And of course, some records may have those, or some instruments may have those, others may not. We're also missing cited by and collects, which would be used to connect to articles and to data sets, and also has metadata, which is a connection to more detailed metadata for an instrument. So we have a lot of opportunities, and it's interesting that between last September, sort of the historic trends or early adopters, and then people that have added in instruments since that time, we've seen a lot of decreases in the completeness of some of these more descriptive elements. And I think that's an unfortunate trend that we need to try and, we can address that trend and help instrument creators and users describe them more completely. So this is a graph, has an organization which is in Germany, but I wanted to sort of give you an idea of how this multiple levels of detail works. At the center here, we have an organization. We have a number of instruments that are run here. And in this case, we only have identifiers for those. So this is sort of the view into this network of instruments, which tools see. We're interested in finding the connections, and these are the kinds of connections that might exist. And the identifiers are really the critical piece here. As we go to resource types, remember this is the full text description of the resource in addition to instrument, which is the more general. And here we see actually names of sort of groups of these instruments. This is beamlines in Germany, and we can see the beamlines that we can see multiple instruments that are on either experimental stations or beamlines. So this is the next level of detail. And then finally, for humans, we have the final level, which is the titles of these things. So now we can see this is Helmholtz Zentrum in Berlin. We still have the beamlines with their titles, and then we have titles of papers. The green are papers that have used these instruments. And then on the right, there's a proceedings article. So once again, as we go back and forth, increasing levels of detail in this graph being useful for humans and machines. I mentioned has metadata, and has metadata is an important connection that we can take advantage of. So when an instrument gets a DOI, it has metadata in DataCite, and we've talked about that a little while or a little bit. It also has a landing page that is in HTML, and then the has metadata is the connection from that DataCite metadata in the DataCite repository to more detailed metadata that could be in a number of different formats in a number of places, maybe JSON LD, maybe SensorML, maybe NCML if you're dealing with some HDF or NetCDF data. But so we have a spectrum of types of information that we can provide, some focused on humans and some focused on tools. Commons.datacite.org is a new viewer, which is being developed by DataCite. It's something that brings together multiple elements of the sort of what I call the global research infrastructure. Crossref is similar to DataCite with a focus mostly on articles. We mentioned I mentioned ROR and ORCID, identifiers for organizations and people. And DataCite, the commons that DataCite brings these together. These numbers are a little bit, these are from last fall, but over 23 million publications, almost 19 million data sets, and about 500,000 software. And you can see the history of these with software and data sets maybe going up a little bit, and then connections between these things. So 8 million cited publications. And of course, that we expect to be lower and something that builds up over time. Cited data sets and cited software. So identifying things, identifying publications and data sets and software, and then connecting them. So if we look at DataCite 4, we mentioned 2DCC before as an organization that's created some instruments in metadata. As I mentioned, DataCite Commons allows you to look for works or people or organs or organizations or repositories. So here I'm looking at the repository, which is 2DCC. We can see the histogram that they've published 61 instruments in 2025. And if we click on find related works, we take advantage of the connections. We find the works in this case, and instruments come under works because they have DOIs. So here's that DynaCool instrument that I had the cool picture of in the last slide. I'm sure maybe there are probably people here who know more about that than I, but so these are the works related to that repository. And if we click on one of those, we go to the page for that specific work. We see some of the metadata showing up here. So the description here is the abstract that I mentioned before. And we see how you would, on the left side here, how you would reference this instrument in a paper with the DOI. And these other tabs here show authors, creators, contributors, funders related to this instrument. So if those items are filled in, then we can see them in the Commons. And then up to 200 citations or references or resources available as a CSV file. So these are downloading a sample of things that are connected to this instrument that you can use for analysis in some way. So Commons, many of you probably remember the early days of web search. I like to call Commons the Alta Vista of this connected infrastructure of all kinds of resources and people and funders. It's early days for Commons. DataCite it's a work in progress, and it will remain in progress for some amount of time. But it's starting to give us an idea of how we can use these different connections to instruments, to papers, to funders, to software, to people, to organizations, to start to see this connected infrastructure emerging. The goal is to connect many things. We see instruments down here on the lower right, projects, researchers, organizations, data sets, software, all these things connecting together. And in this picture, there are a number of the large infrastructure providers that are around the world that are supporting this vision. That's the end.